Since the dawn of navigation on the largest of the Great Lakes, the harbor of Munising Bay has been used as a safe haven for all types of vessels attempting to escape the angry wrath of Lake Superior. But areas surrounding the bay presented numerous dangers. Heavy fog, hidden shoals, and sheer rock cliffs often lie in wait to challenge the best of lake captains. It's no surprise that many a vessel and her crew met a horrifying end there, often within sight of shore. Hi there, I'm Doug Burmick, your host. Join us as we descend into the skeletons of Michigan's maritime past at the mysterious depths and rocky shallows of the Alger Underwater Preserve.
Sailor, what do you do with a drunken sailor? What do you do with a drunken sailor? Lie in the morning. Put him in a bunk with the skipper's daughter. Put him in a bunk with the skipper's daughter. Put him in a bunk with the skipper's daughter. Lie in the morning.
Yo-ho, and up she rises, yo-ho, and up she rises, yo-ho, and up she rises, early in the morning.
Pristine and beautiful, the cool, clean water of the lake once known as Gitchagumi holds much to explore, and Lake Superior also holds fast to many of her mysteries.
We're not sure how many shipwrecks we have along the pictured rocks that we have not yet discovered. The best estimate could be upwards of a dozen. And that could, for example, include the very small fur trading schooner Merchant, lost in June of 1847 with all hands. Finding the Merchant would be unlocking, I think, the secret to one of the great went missing shipwrecks of Lake Superior. Somewhere in the depths, just off of the pictured rocks or Grand Island, we have this very small vessel that will be a treasure trove for marine archaeologists.
Native Chippewa legend describes a sailing ship sinking near Grand Island around the time of the Merchant's disappearance. She was lost with 14 souls and may never be found. Native Americans had great respect for the powerful spirit Coetin controlling the northern winds and were well aware of his many moods as they paddled the shoreline in fragile birch bark canoes.
The first Euro-American settler was Abraham Williams, who arrived here in 1840 from Decatur, Illinois. He brought his family up here and lived right on the point near where we're excavating now. And in fact, when he was invited to live on Grand Island by an Ojibwa chief who said that the area just south of where Abraham Williams' first house was located was called Keteodena, which in Ojibwa means ancient village. And that's where I think we're excavating today.
One of the first white settlers in the newly acquired Michigan wilderness, Williams quickly gained the respect of the Native Americans as an honest man, employing his many skills as a merchant and craftsman while raising his family on Grand Island. The lake claimed 2 of his children. The mid to late 1800s saw an explosion of activity on the Michigan shore of Lake Superior as immigrants poured into the area to work for the lumber companies, harvesting the seemingly endless bounty of the Upper Peninsula forest. The shipping activity increased as large deposits of copper and iron ore were mined in the western Upper Peninsula. The opening of the Sioux Locks in 1855 connected Lake Superior to the trade routes of the lower lakes. Larger vessels were constructed to accommodate the growing need for raw materials in a fast-growing nation. In later years, Abraham Williams employed Native Americans to supply cordwood to the new steam-powered ships coasting the pictured rock shoreline. One of those vessels may have been the sidewheel steamer Superior.
If your ship is driven up against the cliffs in a storm, you can be fairly certain that disaster will follow, that the shipwreck will be total without hope of salvage. I think the example of the sidewheeler Superior, wrecked in October of 1856 with the loss of 36 lives right up against the cliffs of Spray Falls, well illustrates the danger of being driven up against those rocks.
Built in Perrysburg, Ohio in 1845, the Superior was 191 feet long and well known at her stops along the Michigan shoreline, as she and vessels like her were the only form of transportation for consumer goods and passengers in the Upper Peninsula. After being swamped by heavy seas along one of the most dreaded coastlines on the Great Lakes, the Superior was smashed to pieces at the bottom of Spray Falls as horrified passengers and crew attempted to cling to the cliffs of pictured rocks pounded by icy waves. Adding to the tragic loss of life was the unforgiving wilderness in which wreck survivors were exposed to for days while attempting to reach safety on Grand Island. In all, 35 lives were lost. Parts of the ill-fated steamer can still be found among the rocks and shifting sand near the cliff. The wreck on the bottom of Grand Island's Murray Bay has been somewhat of a mystery for many years. It has been called the Dreadnought, the Arnold, and the Granada. Through the research of Fred Stonehouse and others, it is thought to be most likely the wreck of the canal schooner Bermuda, which sank off the shore of Munising with the loss of 3 lives in 1870. Salvagers raised and towed the Bermuda to Murray Bay, where she filled and sank for the last time in the failed attempt to recover the vessel. The wreck lies in 30 feet of water in the bay, protected from waves and flowing ice. After more than 130 years, she remains nearly intact and is a favorite among snorkelers and divers of all experience levels.
Bermuda is another vessel. That particular vessel, there was about 300 of these vessels built in the 1800s, and they all were built with certain specifications. They were built 130 feet long by 30 feet wide, and they all had raisable centerboards so that they were able to go through the Welland Canal, because at that time that was the only canal that they could go through to make the Great Lakes route. And when she first sank in 1870, over by the paper mill, there was a seiche that had happened, and they pull water out. A storm can pull water out of the bay here and then bring it back in really quick. And when the vessel Bermuda was just moored down by the paper mill, because at that time Munising wasn't in town, it was just a swamp, and the actual town was Wetmore, which was up the hill by the lumber yard in Munising there. When the boat was moored there, 2 of the guys, the sailors on the boat, were supposed to be watching the boat and pumping it out. Well, they had fallen asleep during this seiche. The boat was on an angle that when the seiche came back in, it actually came in so fast that the boat wasn't able to recover, and it flooded the boat and drowned 2 of those sailors. They buried the sailors on Grand Island here, and they are with an unmarked grave that just says sailor.
One of the features of the Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore is the number of shipwrecks that we have located along our shoreline. And this area between basically Whitefish Point and Munising is considered the shipwreck coast, and the Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore comprises 42 miles of that shipwreck coast. And along that shoreline we do have 3 wrecks that are easily visible from the shore that folks can actually walk on at the shore and lake interchange there. And those wrecks are available or accessible right by our Hurricane River Campground, which has the access road going to Ausable Lighthouse. And that's located, the Hurricane Campground and Ausable Lighthouse is located about 25 miles east of Munising, or about 17 miles west of Grand Marais, right in the National Lakeshore. One of the reasons that we do have so many wrecks along this coastline, the shipwreck coast, is because in the mid-1850s, in 1855 actually, the Soo Locks opened, and that opened up the opportunity for a lot of the resources in this upper Great Lakes region to be explored, mined, and transported to lower lakes. The copper, the iron ore, timber, lumber was a big industry up here. You know about lumber barges that back then they didn't have the Coast Guard oversight that you have now in shipping, so anything that floated was used for transportation, and ships were overloaded. They were of course, some of them weren't really seaworthy. There was no checks and balances of whether something was seaworthy or not. It was just get it on the water, get it filled, and have it move cargo. So there were a lot of shipwrecks during that particular period, and we see those remnants of those along the shoreline and out in this area. The Alger Underwater Preserve is another example of where there's a number of wrecks that are located for that very same reason. Shipwrecks back then are kind of like automobile and car wrecks today. You know, you hear about the number of them, and they were pretty much taken for granted. When you read the documentation of a lot of the ships, it talks about it foundering or being wrecked and salvaged, and somebody else is running them, and they're back into service several times. So it seems quite almost romantic shipwrecks now, and it's certainly intriguing, but it was commonplace back then. Anytime you read any newspaper articles or anything like that, there was always in a newspaper talked about some kind of shipwreck somewhere. One of the interesting things about those shipwrecks that are located within basically walking distance, that's kind of a unique thing, to be able to walk right up to a shipwreck. You can walk on pretty much the ribs, and the keel is all that's left on those. They come up on shore, they get beat to death by the waves, the ice works on them, and basically the erosion factor, and just breaks them up and lays them out, and eventually all you find is the stuff that's partially submerged in the sand and the lake at the shore. But you can walk on these shipwrecks just from basically a few-minute walk from your car. You can be stepping on shipwrecks, and that's kind of a unique experience, and it certainly does expose you to some maritime history that a lot of folks don't have the opportunity to experience. If you have more vessels on the lakes, the chances of having wrecks and mishaps are much greater. And at that time was kind of the heyday when there was so many different vessels there. It was also the time when there was being some switching over from wooden vessels to steel-hulled vessels. And a lot of times a steel-hulled vessel would put in tow some of the old wooden vessels, the old sailing vessels that were stripped out and just used as a barge. And to some degree, their being older probably offered the opportunity for these things to sink more often because they weren't as structurally sound. The care and feeding of a barge is certainly a lot less than that of another, like a steel-hulled steamer. And so these things were just kind of used almost as trailers, and their care probably wasn't nearly as acute as there would be with say a steam vessel or something, some of the newer things. So I think because of the switchover from older vessels and kind of obsolete vessels to some of this new stuff at the turn of the century that they were using under steam power and steel hulled, I think a lot of times that there was a lot of junk out in the water that certainly lend itself to sinking. Towards the later part of the 1800s, a lot of lighthouses, particularly the 1860s and 1870s, a lot of lighthouses were installed in the lakes to help alleviate some of this congestion problem and the navigation problems. The captains back then did what was called coasting, and they would stay close enough to shore to look at the landmarks along the shoreline, but then that drew them into the hazards that were found along there, like the shoals, particularly at Au Sable Point, where that shoal extends out at least a mile. You know, you're close enough so you can see what's going on shore to be able to tell where you are, but then you're also drawn to those hazards. And so we saw a lot of activity that these things would run aground. Bad weather. Pictured rocks is the reason that it's a national lakeshore, is because of the striking rock shoreline, the aggressive cliffs and things like that. Well, there's no place to put a boat in safe harbor when you have the coastline that's aggressive rocks and things like that. So if the weather gets bad and you were making a mad dash to Munising Harbor, you got caught halfway in between at Spray Falls or you know, Miners Beach or something like that. You know, there's no place to go but just up against either the rock wall or a ground at some of the sand areas or onto those shoals. So weather had a lot to do with the traffic congestion, just the number of vessels that were out there, crews that weren't well trained and that weren't, you know, there's certainly things with drunken captains and people in charge of the vessel that wasn't really capable of operating it. And having mishaps. So there was a lot of things. And then as we got into the 20th century, particularly after things like the Titanic tragedy, then there are a lot more regulations and stipulations on what seaworthy vessels were and what kind of equipment they have on them. And I think a lot of the seriousness of the accidents and a lot of the numbers of accidents started relaxing for that point. So I think the demand for more stringent requirements for vessels and qualifications came about because of this great number of wrecks that were occurring and stuff during the later part of the 1800s.
Hang on the line going down. The wreck that Ben and Randy are diving on is called the Smith Moore. It was built in 1880, and in 1889, in July, she was coming in to the bay here for a little bit of refuge because it was a little rough. And it was really foggy out. As she was coming in, she was blowing her foghorn. James Picans was another vessel that was coming. That particular vessel was also blowing the foghorn. The Smith Moore thought that they had started to veer because of the sound of where the noise kept going when they were hearing the foghorns. But unfortunately, when they were about 75 yards from each other, they actually could see each other at that point. It was kind of too late to do anything. It's kind of hard to turn a 200-foot some vessel length in a snap of the hat. The Picans ran into the bow of the Smith Moore. She kind of like bounced off. The Picans kind of like bounced off and wasn't damaged, and she didn't think the Smith Moore was damaged either, so she just kept on going. The Smith Moore kept sounding a distress signal, and the Drake came and they were probably about 5 miles out. They came in and towed her in. Well, at this time, that lighthouse there, George Pryor Lighthouse is what it's called, or East Channel Lighthouse. Well, George Pryor was the lighthouse keeper at that time. He notes in his logs that 2 ships came in and 1 sank. And the vessel that sank, obviously, was the Smith Moore. She was taking too much water on from the bow collision. When she sank here in the middle of the channel, her mast stuck 15 feet out of the water. She was a 3-masted sail steam vessel, and which was unusual for that day and age of that size of vessel to have 3 masts and a steam. When she sank, like I said, her masts were out of the water. Over that whole summer, eventually they ripped her mast down because other vessels that come into the area, they would always think, wow, this is pretty dangerous here. There's a shipwreck right there. So they tore the mast down. About a year later, the owner of the vessel sent down a hard hat diver to see if she was worth salvaging, bringing her up or bringing her cargo up, which she was carrying iron ore, but it was a low grade of iron ore, and after being in the water, that iron ore would get mushy, and so it wasn't worth salvaging. In 1987, Mother Nature moved a little bit of her sandbar onto the wreck. She used to have her, all 3 decks were penetrable at one time, and you could also swim down to the rudder, but it's still a great dive if you've never been on the wreck. It's got a beautiful railing system in the back on the stern. It's about 8 foot tall. Like I said, it's intact. It's really nice, a lot of fun. About 87 feet to the deck, and if you get up in the bow, you can get into like 100 to 104 feet. So it's a cool, nice dive.
The Kiowa was built in 1920 as part of a large-scale project to replace deep-sea freighters lost to submarine attacks in World War I. On November 30th, 1929, she was downbound from Duluth to Chicago near the pictured rocks when her cargo of flax seed shifted in the heavy seas, causing the freighter to list, which allowed the freezing water to pour onto her deck. The crew watched in horror as Captain Alex Young and 4 other crew members were dumped into an icy grave among the towering waves in a failed attempt to launch a lifeboat. One body was later recovered. The ice-crusted hull slowly filled as the ship drifted helplessly. The remaining crew members climbed to the pilot house to await their fate. Prayers were answered, and the water stopped rising just as waves washed a few feet below the 18 huddled men. The Kiowa struck bottom. The weary and thankful crew was rescued the next day by the efforts of selfless sportsmen of the U.S. Coast Guard in the blizzard conditions of the northern gale. Following the wreck, the population of whitefish is said to have exploded as the fish fed on the ship's cargo. Today, much of the Kiowa remains in 40 feet of water off the coast of 12 Mile Beach.
Ben and I dove the other day, Sunday, on the Kiowa, which is 22 miles up the shoreline here towards Grand Marais. And that's one of our only natural known shipwrecks that are steel in the preserve system. And the Kiowa was coming downbound from Duluth, and it was carrying flaxseed. They ended up going aground out by 12 Mile Beach. And in fact, it was a very severe storm, very cold, and they lost, I think it was 5 or 6 crew members. One was found later on and frozen to death in one of the life rafts from the Kiowa. This was on November 30th, 1929 when this happened. And this was just before, obviously, World War II. When World War II came, they actually salvaged quite a bit of the steel off of the Kiowa. So what is left of the Kiowa is still very interesting. There's lots of brass that looks like somebody's polishing it every day because it's nice sandy ground that it's laying in there. I'd say probably like a 150-foot section of it's still there. A lot of machinery, boilers, and like I said, brass, the brass works of the vessel, that the pipings, the fittings, anything that would have been brass, a lot of that stuff is there. It's a lot of fun, and it's about 25 feet to, it gets down to about 38 feet in depth. So excellent, excellent dive. Some 15 years ago, they didn't have parks, what they call preserves, underwater preserves in this area. This is the Alger Underwater Preserve. And Alger was the first preserve formed in the state of Michigan. And there are other ones across the state in lower Michigan and all the other lakes. And what that is we made them preserves so that people wouldn't come along and steal things off the vessels.
That literally divers were ripping us off, stealing artifacts from shipwrecks, that we even had furniture companies that were going out recovering the entire wooden hull and manufacturing furniture out of them. Simply was deplorable that this could be allowed to continue.
Come up with a good artifact, you didn't have a very good dive. But ethics had to change because there's obviously going to be future divers, and we got preserves started, and Alger was one of them.
The Alger Underwater Preserve was the first preserve in Michigan, started in 1981, and that one really led the way for the state. And right now we have a dozen underwater preserves in Michigan, but Alger was number one. Alger was the one that showed that it could be done and also showed the importance of doing it.
Underwater preserves in Michigan were established to protect shipwrecks. The law was modified in 1988 to allow the intentional sinking of one vessel in each preserve to serve as a dive attraction as long as the vessel had a historic connection to the Great Lakes. In 1994, the 71-foot tug Stephen M. Selvik was donated to the Alger Preserve by the Selvik Marine and Towing Company at the request of Preserve Committee President Peter Linquist. In the 2-year project, Linquist and a group of volunteers towed the tugboat from Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin to Munising and prepared it for the sinking. The Selvik was built in Cleveland, Ohio in 1915 and was originally named the Lorraine. In 1957, she worked on the construction of the Mackinac Bridge, earning her place in Michigan's maritime history. She now lies in 70 feet of water just off of Grand Island's Trout Point, where she serves as an underwater museum piece to be visited by divers for generations to come.
Is the Stephen M. Selvik. That's our first intentionally sunk vessel in the state of Michigan, and in fact it's the only intentionally sunk vessel. They are trying to sink the Mackinac right now, but Selvik is right now the one and only that's intentionally sunk in state, and she's 70 feet long and she's a 70-ton tug. She's got a Fairbanks Morris engine in her, and she's probably about 15 feet wide. And when we sank her in 1996, before we sank her, she actually sank one other time before that. The winter before we sank her, she actually sank in the bay out in front of the shop area, and a through-hull bolt fitting froze and busted loose. The vessel actually sank in about 15 feet of water, and her decks were awash, and it took us 3 days. We had a group of divers from Wisconsin come up and help us, and we used lift bags and pumped the air into the boat to try to get all the water out, and finally on the 3rd day we got her up, but we thought maybe she was going to be a permanent snorkeling site, but it didn't happen. So June 1st, 1996, we were able to sink her in the spot that we wanted, which is just north of Trout Point out here. She's in about 60 feet of water, and she lays on her side. The first winter that she was down, Mother Nature wasn't too nice to her. She basically picked her up and moved her about 20 feet and pointed her bow to the west from what was pointing towards the north. So, and she broke several ribs on the side, so you can actually touch the pilot house if you were standing on the bottom. So, but it actually looks like a real wreck, like we didn't intentionally sink it there. So, but it's a lot of fun. It's a pretty good intermediate, easy dive to do. When we were in the process of picking a vessel to sink, we wanted something that had heritage, marine heritage to the Great Lakes. Initially, we almost got a 450-foot freighter, which I'm glad we didn't get. So we ended up finding the Stephen M. Selvik from Selvik Towing and Marine down in Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin. And this tug was built in 1912, I believe it was. She originally had a couple of different names before the Stephen M. Selvig. She was Lorraine and also the Cabot. She also had worked on the Mackinac Bridge, which was our significance to being a working vessel on the Great Lakes, so we ended up choosing her for a vessel to sink.
Although hundreds of thousands of certified divers live in the Great Lakes region, most of them choose to travel to the Caribbean reefs and other warm water sites for their diving adventures, never plunging into the Great Lakes, while some of the best preserved shipwrecks in the world are just a few hours' drive from their homes. Many believe the Great Lakes to be too cold for comfort. The reality is that even the coldest Lake Superior is usually within the comfort range of a wetsuit at sport diving depths during the summer months.
Thank you for joining us. I'm Doug Burmick. Until next time, please respect and enjoy the treasures of our Great Lakes.